protests are dead, literally. The government decides enough's enough and disperse the protest and charge them with criminal offences long afterwards. This is because mass surveillance networks and modern technology make it trivially easy for any government to squash dissent. And make no mistake, I'm not only talking about totalitarian regimes like Russia, but Western countries like the USA and Europe. So that begs the question, how did the government get so good at stopping protests? To help you understand, let's pretend that you're the President of the United States and there is a protest happening right in front of the White House. Let's say that the protesters oppose your political beliefs and you want to stop them. Thankfully, you're the president. You have plenty of experts to rely on, and more importantly, access to surveillance tech that the protesters, do not. We have the tech and the expertise. How could we use it to deal with those pesky protesters? The strategy is simple. Identify, monitor, and crush. Those are the 3 steps to stop the protest. The first step to everything is to identify the protesters. From the activists who organized the event, down to those who showed up to support, anyone remotely related must be identified. An easy way for the government to do this is through social media. Every activist secretly wishes that they are known on platforms like Facebook or X, and every protester wants to share videos and photos of the protests as well. Surveillance tools can exploit these desires by finding everyone who posted or interacted with posts about the protest on those platforms. Even if those platforms have privacy safeguards, as the government, you can demand the platform to give that information to you anyways. At this point, I'm sure you might be wondering, what happens if some of the protesters don't use social media? Even if they don't use social media, there is another trick to identify them. Stingrays, also known as IMSI catchers, act like fake radio towers that trick their phones into giving away its unique number called the IMSI. Now, every protester has a unique ID to distinguish them from the crowd. On top of that, you can ask telecom companies to reveal the identities of people based on those IMSIs as well. At this point, we're approaching an unrealistic scenario. But what if they don't even have phones? Meet facial recognition and gait recognition. I'm sure everyone knows facial recognition. Show a computer an image, and it recognizes the people in that image. Gait recognition is similar, but instead of getting a computer to identify faces from images, the computer checks a video, and it identifies people based on how they walk. What is important to keep in mind is that gait recognition can recognize people from almost any angle, and it has a long range of 156 feet or 50 meters. Of course, tech only gets better over time, so don't be surprised if the range doubles or triples by the time you watch this video. Now that we've identified the protesters, let's monitor their activity. Monitoring the protesters helps to identify even more protesters and allows law enforcement to better react and deal with the protest. How governments typically monitor the situation is through cameras, and lots of them. Cameras worn by police, cameras mounted onto walls, even cameras taped onto drones. They are all used to create a clear picture of what is happening in a protest. The police could feed all of that footage in and apply facial and gait recognition to identify anyone they didn't already know and track movements on the ones they do know. Another method of monitoring is to spy on their phones. Typically, people normally send messages on social media, which we have mentioned before, could easily be accessed. But what about calling or texting? Using our trusty Stingrays, we can activate its secondary mode to catch any wireless messages in its range. That's right, Stingrays can also allow police to wiretap your phone. But what about apps like WhatsApp and Signal that use end-to-end encryption? Through state-sponsored hacking, even that can be monitored. When authorized, law enforcement can use cyber weapons to break into phones and computers without permission. Once it's compromised, encryption would be pointless. They can see your messages exactly how you would. Furthermore, all of your stored data will also be visible by police, like photos, videos, and browsing history. Now that you, the government, are able to identify and monitor those pesky protesters, it's time to crush them. Let's start by arresting the protesters. Knowing the whereabouts of everyone there can help law enforcement divide and conquer, making arrests trivially easy. Listening in on the protesters' calls and messages allows you to stay one step ahead. Tracking those who are very outspoken and notable allows police to prioritize arresting them. At this point, the protest has been quelled. Many would assume that the strategy of identify, monitor, and crush ends here. Unfortunately for the protesters, it's only just begun. Remember the first part of the strategy, identify. We know who those protesters are, down to their name and what they look like. Now remember the second part of the strategy, monitor. Not only do we know what the protesters did during the protest, but also after the protest, meaning that we know where they live and where they work. As the government, you don't like those protesters. The last thing you'd want is another protest on your hands. So how do you get them to stop? Of course, you won't give them what they want, and arresting them again is too boring. Besides, there are far more effective and interesting ways to deal with them. Let's start with predictive policing. This topic alone can be its own separate video, but to sum it all up, it feeds the protesters' personal data into an advanced surveillance system. This surveillance system predicts when and where protesters might plan or conduct activities. Then additional police are assigned there to intimidate them from doing so. The second method is to freeze the protesters' bank accounts. Instead of arresting them, you can simply make their life a living hell by denying them access to their finances and forcing them to use cash in a cashless society. The best example of this is where an organizer of the Canadian Freedom Convoy could not pay for bail because their account was frozen. Moreover, the account was unfrozen after the court decided to deny them the chance for bail. How convenient. And the third is, this is not an exaggeration. In November 2023, Canadian activists protested against the CEO of Indigo Bookstores for her support of a program that provides tuition for those who join the Israeli Defense Forces. They protested by splashing washable paint onto their storefronts and posted posters criticizing the CEO. The response was a nighttime police raid. The same raids reserved for busting major drug and gun operations were used to terrorize protesters who vandalized private property. No matter what you think of that protest and their methods, we shouldn't overlook the lengths that governments can go to crush dissent. But enough about them. Let's discuss how you fit into all of this. You are a free citizen of a free country. Sure, protests are popping up and getting crushed, but you're not a part of them. In fact, you might be opposed to them, like how Democrats oppose Republicans. In theory, you have nothing to worry about, right? That depends. Do you align with what the government considers to be good? The government can talk about how steadfast their policies are, but they will change their tune the moment it stops benefiting them. The USA once allowed women to have abortions through medical clinics in all states, but recently, more and more states are outlawing abortions. Now, victims of sexual assault must choose between a life-ruining pregnancy or be charged as a criminal. What would be the solution to this? A protest against the government, of course. The same government who has unchecked surveillance capabilities. The same government that practiced applying identify, monitor, and crush for years. And the same government that faced no consequences when doing all of that because its citizens are either intimidated into silence or simply don't care. Even if you are the president or in a position of power, squashing protests could actually accelerate the government's collapse. Activists who once organized peaceful protests would begin plotting insurrections instead. Violence would increase dramatically. By the time the government collapses, millions would die. On top of that, the new government that replaces the old one will be unstable for years to come, which means even more deaths and even more hardship. So now what? As citizens of a free country, are we doomed to have our voices be silenced by government-sponsored surveillance? Not exactly. There is a way to fight and take back power, so that protests remain both safe and constructive for both the people and the government. First, begin by being more privacy conscious. Try out more privacy-friendly web browsers, and place the info you send to companies under more scrutiny. We're not asking you to disappear from the internet overnight, but instead asking you to make yourself a little more difficult to spot. Second, is to get the people around you to think about privacy more often. Talk to your friends and family about the right to privacy, how it's an issue, and how important it is to take that right back. Third is to be involved in politics. Raise privacy concerns to elected representatives and offer solutions to fix them. Team up with like-minded people to lobby for better privacy safeguards, and if you are up for it, you can try being in a government position to bring change from within. But what if you're still not convinced, and you still believe that protests are the most effective way to get your voice heard? I won't stop you from doing something you believe in, but I suggest you take the precautions to stay safe before, during, and after a protest. Please check out my next video on how to do exactly that. And as always, your privacy matters.